Bryan Ma. Welcome back to the TechVerse Talks podcast.
Hey, Charles.
Hi, how's everything going in Singapore today?
Yeah, good. Wish you were still here.
I know, it's kind of lonely without you, but at least we had a week and a half together in Singapore, so it's a good start. So today we're going to get our annual updates from you on what's the latest with smartphones and devices. And there's one thing that's on everybody's mind, which is the tariff situation. So we're going to cover that. But also you were in Taipei last week for Computex. So we'll get some insights about what's going on there as well. And the one I want to start with is this whole China situation with the tariffs. And initially the US said they were going to increase tariffs on smartphones and components up to 145%. They then reduced that down to 30%. And then China lowered theirs as well. So the market loved that. It was great news. But really, what did you think of that announcement? Did it really matter that much for the device manufacturers?
No, because the devices were already exempt, right? Actually, a few days after that whole 145% deal, they already said as part of this whole semiconductor effort that it was mostly exempt. They're still subject to a 20% baseline tariff or fentanyl tariff. But I think maybe back to your question, though, the reason why the markets breathed such a big sigh of relief after this most recent deal in early May, despite the fact that electronics coming in from China were already partially exempt. The reason is because, of course, clarity, right? Finally, like an encouraging sign that, there's progress that can be made in this trade war. These parties can come to an agreement, even if it's still 20, 30%, whatever it might be, and still some uncertainty, but at least it's not as uncertain as things were back in April, right? You remember back in April when Liberation Day came around and then, 90-day pause and whatever this and that. It was kind of like every other day, everyone was like, oh my gosh, what is going on? What's going to be next? And there was just so much confidence that was sapped from the industry. So I think in that transition period, in fact, if we look at this entire tariff spectrum, we started back in February at 10%, moved to March, it was like 20%. Going to April, it was all sorts of craziness. And then finally by May, it was kind of like, okay, at least there's something clear, a little more clear now. Granted, we're not out of the woods. There's still that day 91 is still approaching as we start getting to July. But at least the early signs that we saw from May were that, okay, there's a little more clarity now, and maybe there are some agreements that can be made. As far as the electronics go, don't forget, the electronics are largely exempt. And by the way, a lot of these vendors are steering around this anyway by shifting manufacturing elsewhere. But the other thing to keep in mind, too, is that it's not just about the direct impact to the prices from the tariffs. The other thing is just the broader economic impact to everything that's going on. When businesses, fast-moving consumer goods, furniture, automotive, whatever, aren't sure where those tariffs are going to land and how they have to adjust their supply chain, that negatively impacts purchasing decisions, not just for the IT departments of these businesses, but the employees who don't know where their next paycheck is going to be as an individual consumer looking to buy. So those are the things that we need to keep in mind. It's not just the impact to the tariffs or the tariff impact to the prices of the products, but also from a demand side, if you will.
And I think the uncertainty is the key here. It's just been skyrocketing since all these tariff situations and the threat of trade wars, because we're at record levels of uncertainty when it comes to trade and economic policy right now. And that's seeping down into the consumers. So who knows where the demand's going to come from? And would you really want to buy a new phone now if you don't know what it's going to cost? I wanted to go a little bit more into what the OEMs were doing, because we talked about this when we were together in Singapore a couple of weeks ago. Apple's strategy had a pretty quick workaround to this. So what was Apple going to do to get around the situation with the tariffs in China?
Sure. So Apple's been pretty good, much more nimble than I thought they would be in working with its suppliers to redirect its US-bound products from locations like Vietnam instead, or India for that matter, right? India for iPhones and then Vietnam for Macs and other products. So in that sense, at least back then, right, they did their earnings call at the end of April. Back when they were talking about this at that time, this was something where we were looking at basically they could effectively get around this China tariff, or rather the tariff that the US imposed on products coming from China, because they were able to get their products through Vietnam or India. And India is a good example for the iPhone. You may have seen some headlines on this, right, about them airlifting a bunch of products out of India and redirecting them to the US. Keep in mind that Apple has already been manufacturing in India for quite a while. Now, a good part of that is for the domestic market. But a good part of that is also for the EMEA region, right? Europe, Middle East, Africa region. And what ended up happening then is, and we were seeing this in a lot of the shipment records too, hey, you know what? They were able to redivert a lot of those units that were meant for export from India over to the EMEA region. They were able to point them to the US and get them over there, especially in that scramble when back in that April timeframe where there was a lot of uncertainty on what was happening. So that basically is what they've been doing. They've been redirecting a lot of these volumes through other countries.
And some of the other OEMs, like obviously, I don't think Samsung's manufacturing too much out of China. They do a lot of it out of Vietnam. I checked the numbers on this. So depending on which stat you use, Samsung accounts for between 20 and 30% of the GDP coming out of Vietnam. So if you add that with Apple as well, you got to think at some point the US is going to go, wait a minute, we got to start putting tariffs on Vietnam. But what about someone like Samsung? How are they going to be impacted, do you think?
Yeah, exactly. So Samsung, as you rightly pointed out, they've been in Vietnam for a very long time, right? In northern Vietnam, outside of Hanoi. But I guess what was interesting, maybe to tie your point about Samsung and Apple together, I guess what's interesting is even if they're directing things out of Vietnam, as you may have heard Trump over the past weekend or at the tail end of last week, basically was telling Tim Cook that even if you're routing stuff over to India or if somebody like Samsung is routing through Vietnam, Trump wants stuff built in the US, not being diverted to another country like India and Vietnam, right? For any iPhone or an equivalent Samsung phone that is, it doesn't matter if it's being built in India. I'm going to hit it 25% as long as it's not made in the US, which is quite interesting as well.
And I don't think I've seen this before where they're actually targeting individual companies with tariffs like this. And especially a domestic brand. They're actually going to harm that brand by doing it. But there were all these examples that came out after the initial announcements about how if you tried to actually manufacture an iPhone in the US, the costs for the building materials of it would go up from $850 to $3,500 per phone. Now, I'm sure that's an exaggeration, and a lot of it's just clickbait and gaslighting. But I mean, does Apple have any manufacturing in the US right now that could help them with this, where they could easily transition over? And if not, like how long would this take for them to actually be able to manufacture it there?
Yeah, totally. It depends on how you define the manufacturing. They do have a plant in Texas doing like high-end Macs, desktop Macs, but quite limited. So the shorter answers to your questions are that, yes, we've seen estimates from anywhere from just 3 months time to set everything up. If we're talking about just very, very limited, simple kind of manufacturing, like basically all the last steps that you do through the manufacturing process. But more realistically, probably about 1.5 to 2 years to get the factory set up, get people hired, get everyone trained, do all the quality control, all that kind of stuff. It's quite a bit of an effort if we're really talking about full-on manufacturing and assembly going on there. It's not an easy undertaking. It certainly does add cost. And maybe to your example, regardless of if it ends up being a $3,000 iPhone or only even $2,000 iPhone, it's still quite different from a $1,000-ish iPhone. There's pricing pressure upwards. I think what does get interesting, if the cost really is so high, let's just assume if we were to manufacture something in the US, it does hit like a $2,000-ish kind of a price point. Maybe in that sense, that 25% coming out of India or Vietnam isn't that bad. Granted, it's still an increase, but we have to keep in mind, particularly for iPhones and for US buyers, most of these are, I wouldn't say telco subsidized, but you basically pay on installment plans in the US for phones. It wouldn't be as bad, but yes, of course, I don't want to understate or undermine how significant it is. It's still pressure on the price of the product. And that, of course, is going to be the challenge. I think that they will ultimately still come to a resolution which won't be so bad. And I think that Tim Cook very well knows that Trump needs a victory here. He needs to be able to say, yes, this is what I was able to achieve. Now, whether that means an iPhone or all iPhones being manufactured in the US completely, probably not going to be that extreme. Maybe it'll be certain things like, we will do final assembly of some of the more premium products here. Maybe iPhones, maybe to my earlier point about how they already assemble very high-end Macs in Texas, right? They can do some of the, because those are premium products already, right? So given the high cost of labor in the US, that price point was already high in the first place. So what if the resolution here is that Tim Cook says, okay, well, we'll manufacture the high-end products in the US or do final assembly or whatever it might be. We'll see where this goes. I know I'm oversimplifying this because the problem with doing the high-end products in the US is you need a lot of the component suppliers in China to help.
I get worried about this because I do think they are going to force Apple to create a manufacturing facility there, which will not be best of breed as far as capabilities and skill sets or price points. So basically what you're going to do is add a lot into the cost structure of Apple overall. And let's just say they do a third here, a third in India, a third in China to keep it simple. You're suddenly adding a lot of cost to that, which will then have to increase the prices globally for this, or at least in the US. And I think that's the big risk on this, but I do agree they will probably come up with some kind of resolution. He needs a win more than he needs anything else. So he just wants to say, yes, I forced them to pay billions to put together a manufacturing plant, and that's good for America. But I mean, trust me, I don't feel overly confident about getting a really high-end technical product coming out of the U.S. with their manufacturing right now. We should move on from this because we could just talk about this one forever. But now let's go take a look at some of the other smartphone manufacturers. So does this actually create an opportunity maybe for some of the Chinese manufacturers to go to other parts of the world where maybe there's going to be a little bit of anti-American sentiment, or it could be eventually anti-Apple sentiment, or is China's market for their devices still going to be locally?
Well, the Chinese vendors are already quite aggressive in markets like Western Europe, increasingly more in Latin America. Of course, here in Southeast Asia, they're quite big as well, too. So they've already been doing so. But you notice out of that list of geographies that I just rattled off, didn't include the US, right? Because the Chinese vendors generally are not in the US. There's a few here and there. There's Motorola, which is owned by Lenovo. There's a smaller vendor called Blue and a few others. But generally, the Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi's, basically. The big Chinese vendors, and Honor, which is the Huawei spinoff, they're basically not in the US. And so in that sense, they're not as affected by this right now. And a lot of this is really about Apple and Samsung.
Okay. Now we've talked about the smartphone side. What about from the PC perspective? So what is this going to potentially do to the cost of a PC? And does it have a bigger impact on PCs than smartphones, or is it the other way around?
No, very much so. I'm glad you brought it up because, yes, the impact is bigger on the PC side. PCs, you have more units being built in China rather than overseas. And that's mainly because of, well, the assembly and the design of the products, right? PCs are bigger. There are more discrete components. And so in order to assemble a PC overseas, you've got to be able to move a broader ecosystem of component vendors along with you. Otherwise, the logistics costs of getting some little obscure component together becomes too expensive. Whereas a smartphone, because it's so much smaller, everything is integrated into an SoC, right? A system on chip where you can integrate a lot of the various components. And you have what's known as a semi-knockdown, basically, assembly, which makes it easier to assemble smartphones, relatively easier to assemble a smartphone outside of China than it is for PCs. Now, it's not to say that the PC vendors haven't been taking steps to mitigate this. Dell was already quite aggressive. Even, I think they realized during the pandemic as well, too, they needed the so-called China plus one strategy. So they were already quite aggressive in moving a lot of their supply chain over to Vietnam. Now, in that sense, you have other vendors like HP and Lenovo and so forth who are further behind Dell, but HP has been impressively nimble in being able to move its products as well. HP, in its most recent earnings call, said that 90% of their US-bound products by the end of this year were going to be made outside of China. So they've been able to leverage, I think, Thailand and some other Southeast Asian countries in the process. Asus, as another example, has also been able to leverage Southeast Asia. And Lenovo's kind of still a bit of a question mark, but they, even in their most recent earnings call last week, have been talking about how nimble their supply chains are in being able to reroute and possibly through Mexico or wherever it might be. So the PC vendors, back to your question, yeah, the PCs are harder than phones to do overseas, but it doesn't mean that the PC vendors are standing still either. They've been able to rather impressively move a lot of this already.
So I know that the U.S. strategy for doing this is to bring a lot of manufacturing back to the U.S., but I do think it also creates quite a bit of opportunity. I mean, just the list of countries that you were talking about there, where people are starting to ship their manufacturing, so it's China plus one. Do you think you're going to see a lot more going into Southeast Asia and into India? And could that really be a boom for those economies?
Yeah, well, certainly so. Yes, we've already been seeing this, right, over the past good number of years, moving to Indonesia, for instance, and a lot of the local governments are helping to facilitate this. That's actually what held up iPhone 16s going into Indonesia earlier this year. And the Indonesian government basically said, okay, we want you to basically do more here in this country, whether it's building AirPods or hiring more software developers like basically Apple was doing previously in previous years to keep the Indonesian government happy. or at least training software developers, should say, is probably the more accurate way of putting that. So yes, we are seeing more of that momentum. And by the way, it's not just Asia. You look at all the stuff that's happening in countries like Brazil, in Mexico, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, and so forth. Supply chains are quite global, and Lenovo always makes a good point of this as well, too, that they have manufacturing in locations all around the world. In fact, most tech vendors, including Intel and others, generally try to talk about this point. So there's increasingly more and more of this momentum happening. And to your point, yes, theoretically can help with the economies as well, too. You talked about Samsung earlier with Vietnam and what a big contribution they make to GDP. It's not just tech either. Don't forget, like, as things like furniture and automotive and all these other products potentially start to get manufactured out of out of China, most likely Southeast Asia in a lot of cases, there's some upside in this. If this can help drive economies in Southeast Asia, get consumers spending more, get businesses spending more, in theory, there's some upside to this. But I preface that, I qualify that comment thing in theory, because again, it could be just as easily the next day when we realize, you know what? The US government is not happy about that either. And bam, tariff on this country or that country. And then suddenly everything collapses. So,
and he did already some of the Southeast Asian countries with some pretty high tariffs, but we should move on from that. I want to go on to one of my other favorite, most interesting buzzwords. So last year, there was a lot of hype around AI PCs, but I haven't heard that much about it. You were just at Computex. What's your take on that right now? Is it still a thing, or is it just something, is this like the next metaverse type concept that's going to just fizzle away?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be that floofy like metaverse. AI PCs are definitely still happening. In fact, we still continue to see, the way we define it is based upon the presence of an NPU. This is basically a local AI accelerator, a portion of the chip that's optimized for AI workloads on device. As we look at the likes of Intel, AMD, and Qualcomm, they're definitely still pushing these products, which is good, to the point where we are looking at more than half of PC volumes next year to include an NPU. Now, what people are doing with that NPU and whether there's a real use case around, that's still the part that's shaky. And I think the industry still is going to need a number of years to get that sorted out. But maybe to tie this to your point about Computex, I think one interesting thing about Computex this year compared to last year was it did feel a little more low-key than last year. Granted, last year was a bit of an exception. There was just so much hype around AI PCs last year. You had Intel in town, AMD in town, Qualcomm in town. They're all talking about AI PC. We got this processor, we got that processor, all this kind of stuff. This year, there was no Intel keynote. Granted, they're having their own management changes and challenges around that, so it's understandable, but there's no Intel keynote. You look at other vendors like Asus, they didn't do glitzy product launches either. They still launched products, but they did them directly with media rather than doing these glitzy product launches. And even with AMD, Lisa Su wasn't there. Granted, their consumer team was there. They still did a launch, but they weren't really talking about AI PCs as much. It was more about GPUs and workstations and that sort of stuff. This year, it almost seemed as if there was a bit of a pause with AI PCs, or at least from a high visibility keynote perspective. It's not to say that the AI PC momentum wasn't there or the semiconductor vendors weren't there, because they very much were, right? Despite the absence of a keynote and all their management changes, their CEO was in town, engaged with the Taiwan ecosystem, which is very much supplying the PC industry. They were definitely there. They were showing off their next generation product called Panther Lake, which has a high-end NPU, by the way. AMD was certainly there. Qualcomm was there. They had PC OEMs like Lenovo, HP, Acer, Asus on stage. So the momentum was still there, but it was much lower key compared to last year. And of course, the other thing with Computex, by the way, as much as it is a PC show, in the past couple of years, it's become a Jensen Huang show from NVIDIA, because he's just such a rock star, especially in Taiwan, where literally there's crowds. There was one day on the show floor of Computex, he happened to be on the show floor and they had like all these ropes cordoned off. I was like, okay, it's like Lady Gaga that's here or something. It's like, no, it's Jensen Huang walking the floor, signing autographs and stuff. He, of course, is very much now a very big fixture at Computex, but his discussion or announcements were really more about things like data center AI and all the AI factories, and of course this new building that they're building in the northern part of Taipei. Wasn't really so much about AI PCs. So it was more about Jensen just really talking about his data center and digital twins and smart factories and so forth.
And if you go back 20 plus years ago,
Yes.
Steve Jobs changed the entire industry by wearing his black t-shirts. where everybody's a creative with a black t-shirt. Now with NVIDIA's CEO with his leather jacket, do you think everyone's going to switch? Are you going to be wearing leather next time this week?
Yeah, I need to get a leather jacket, right? No, I don't have a leather jacket. But have you seen, by the way, I've seen a Halloween costume. This was floating around. It was a Jensen Huang Halloween costume. Some little kid, very cute, was dressed up as Jensen Huang, his black leather jacket, and I think he sprayed his hair white. It was very cute.
Okay, we talked about AI on PCs. Now let's go to AI on the smartphones. So this has really taken off over the last couple of years. Samsung kicked it off with Galaxy AI. They're on their third major release, and they should have their fourth one, I'm guessing, coming up. And when's it packed? It should be about July, August, or something like that for the next version. Apple then came out, and its AI on the iPhone wasn't as impressive. What do you see going on in this space with AI on the smartphones right now?
Yeah, Apple's a big question mark, right? Because they've been struggling with Siri. They've been kind of promising this next version of Siri that's going to be so much improved and be able to do all these things for you in an agentic manner. But, they publicly stated, oh, yeah, we're behind on this. And whether or not they actually say anything at their developer conference in the next few weeks, rumbling is that they might not have anything yet. So I think that's probably where shareholders are concerned. So Apple is a little further back, and it'll be interesting to see if and who they partner with somebody to get them back on their feet. As you pointed out, Samsung, on the other hand, has been very early to the game, trying to really talk about Galaxy AI and getting a good amount of credit for it in the process. Now, some of the things they've talked about that have resonated with buyers include things like Circle the Search, which is powered by Google, by the way, and is increasingly going to be seen across other Android vendors now that Google is basically building that as well as Gemini into Android. So we'll see more of that across other things. But I think the other thing too is if you look at the various use cases, regardless if it's coming from Samsung, Google, Apple, whomever it might be, earlier I was mentioning how AI PCs were looking for a use case. You could argue on phones still looking for a use case. Now, maybe it's not that bad. On phones, you do have things like Circle to Search. We've anecdotally seen folks, even in developing markets, for instance, going into a store saying, hey, you know what? I want that thing that erases things from the background, the photo bomber, or that thing that doesn't belong in the photo. They might not necessarily think of it as AI, but they know what the practical benefit is. So there is some of that there. Does that alone necessarily motivate sales of phones? Sure, in some cases it does, but not necessarily enough to change the total market size. We're only looking at low single-digit percentage growth. The smartphone market this year is, again, single-digit growth in the past year. This is a mature market. It's relatively flat. It's more so just a transition, a mix shift, if you will, between non-AI phones versus phones that are increasingly AI-enabled.
So I want to go back to Circle the Search real quick, because when it first came out, I thought, well, this is kind of a novelty, but I didn't really understand the real value behind it. And I was with Ian Chong from Samsung, and we were sitting there at an event, and there was this guy that was working with the film crew, and he had these really funky socks. And Ian is famous for his wearing funky socks all the time.
Yeah.
The socks this guy had on were Chupa Chups, like the lollipops. So I had the Chupa Chups logo. And he's like, well, watch this. And I was filming him doing it. He grabbed it. He circled the socks and circled the search, clicked it. It went out there, found them, and he basically ordered them right there. And I thought that was quite fascinating. Because then I realized it's like, that's what you use it for. If you really want to find something quick, I want to know where I can get that. And it's just done immediately. It's something that you could always do by going through the normal steps, but it just does it all for you right there.
Yeah, what you want to do is reduce that friction, right? Make it as easy as possible to do something. And the trick is also to get it beyond just a novelty, right? A party trick, if you will, and get it into something that's really practical. And I think that's where it gets interesting, because developers are going to come up with interesting stuff. We just don't know what that is, right? Everybody asks, what is that killer AI use case for a consumer? There's still no obvious answer.
It might be us that actually figure it out, because if you remember back with telecoms, SMS was not supposed to be a big thing. It was just something that you launched as a feature, but they never knew it would actually take off and then turn into the whole messaging world. But that became the big thing, and it was us, the consumers, that decided it. So maybe it's one of these things, it's out there, but it might not actually be some of the main vendors that come up with it. It might be us on the demand side going, actually, this is what I want to do with it.
Yeah, users will come up with it. User definitely shouldn't underplay the role of consumers or users in this process. By the way, one other thing we should bring up is a very big announcement last week from OpenAI, which was that they were acquiring Johnny Ive's startup called Ive, which the idea here is to design a piece of hardware, undisclosed. They still didn't give a whole lot of details around it, and most likely it'll be some kind of a puck without a screen or something like that. They said it wouldn't be a wearable, but we'll see what it is. But my point is, earlier I was talking about how we need to reduce the friction as much as possible in order to use AI services. That's basically what Sam Altman was saying in the launch video, right? He was saying, how do you access OpenAI today? You pull out your laptop, you open it up, you open the web browser, you go to the OpenAI website and you type in your prompt. There's too many steps in that process. So how do we make it easier to remove all of that friction to access these AI services? And whether or not that manifests itself in glasses, ring, watch, pendant, pin, I don't know, whatever it's going to be. And hopefully with the magic of Johnny Ive, there's something cool here that comes out of it. But the point is that as we look at all of these AI players, whether it's OpenAI or Microsoft or Google and all these guys, if you look at what's really happening here, it's about finding means of distribution of these AI services. That's why you've got Microsoft pushing Copilot through Windows, through Office, through every property that they have, Bing, Edge, all that kind of stuff. It's why you've got Google pushing Gemini through Chrome, through Android, through Workspace, everything that they have. That's why it'll be increasingly interesting to see how not only folks like OpenAI play through this, and of course, OpenAI, don't forget, they're actually powering part of Siri. Also, whatever they may be doing with Johnny Ive's company. And then you think about other companies like Perplexity, which have actually been quite proactive in working with device vendors. Now, granted, with smaller ones like Motorola and Nothing. Nothing's a small Chinese phone vendor, by the way, in case you were wondering what that company is. But these are, what you're seeing here is these guys are looking for means of distribution. Perplexity, by the way, was very eager when the US government was chasing after Google for antitrust issues and suggesting the idea that they'd have to sell off Chrome. Guess who would want Chrome, right? Because it's so omnipresent that it'd be a great way to distribute AI services. This really gets quite interesting between how hardware and devices and the type of hardware that you use collides with these services that need to meet consumers where they are, to meet the users where they are, and make it as easy as possible to use these services. This is what'll get quite fascinating in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
I tell you that just, if you think that this industry has only been around for a little over 2 years now, maybe 2.5 years, how fast it's taken over everything. And I saw a stat, actually I used a stat at an event in Singapore recently that showed that AI take-up within enterprises surveyed by McKinsey has now risen to 78%, but it's taken them since 2017 to get to this point. And in 2 years, Gen AI is almost right behind. It's about 71%. So you're seeing this massive, quick uptake on it. And I just think it's fascinating how it's not only them that are talking about it, but I mean, it's taken over my personal life, the way I do my work, the way I do everything right now. I mean, I never use Google to search anymore. So it's just sort of like, I think it's going to be a very interesting few years. I think we expect it to really transform our lives. I think it's going to do way more than we actually expect.
Well, just to sanity check that a bit, I would point out that there's a difference between the early adopters before it goes mainstream. And while I don't disagree with you that the acceleration and ramp up has been quite significant, there's also a difference in the enterprise example between folks doing proof of concept and organizations that are doing full deployment. On the consumer side, there's a difference between techies like you and I adopting this quickly versus the mainstream. Now, of course, as you look at the grandparents of the world, if you will, that through just using Google search and are starting to realize, oh, there's this AI overview feature within Google search now, and oh, Gemini is now being built in. Yes, that'll help accelerate and facilitate this. But yeah, there's always that leap to get past those early adopters.
And I also want to clarify this. I don't think enterprises are going to make this an incredible success. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, even like most recent survey I saw, I think it was from Bain, 88% of digital transformations failed. And this is in 2024. Now, this number hasn't changed much over the last 7 to 10 years. So just because we have great technology doesn't mean as corporates, we're still not going to completely screw it up when it comes into deployment, which is great for me because I got to do these keynotes and I always want examples of tech screwing up or chatbots behaving badly.
You'll have lots of material.
Okay, so we now covered off AI with the smartphones. Well, what's that next real transition phase for them? Because it's going to be something in the design of it. Are we going to see a lot more on the foldable side? Samsung's, their foldable devices are beautiful. Are we going to finally see one from Apple?
Yeah, great question. I'd separate this into two parts. First, from a short and medium term perspective, and then a longer term one. For the short and medium term, you're right. We're going to see more experimentation in these sorts of devices. We've already seen these bifold and even trifold types of products. Huawei's got that one that expands out to a gigantic screen. I think that's going to stay niche for now. It's still a $3,000 product, reliability and applications. There's still a lot of question marks around that, but we're going to see some experimentation around that. I think Samsung, certainly having seen what Huawei is doing, is probably a lot of pressure internally there to say, hey, well, we got to have something that'll stack up to that, right? Even if Huawei is China only, mostly China only, I'm sure there's the need from a Samsung perspective to try to show that they can still innovate. They've hinted at new innovative form factors coming. So allegedly, they'll have something coming out around that. As you pointed out, Apple, there's rumbling around. Everybody's been asking, when is Apple going to have a foldable phone, right? And there's a lot of question marks around whether there's reliability and supply chain and applications and all that kind of stuff. But don't forget, 20-year anniversary of the iPhone is approaching soon, right? So is this 20-year anniversary product going to be a foldable? Is it going to be a super thin one to fight the Galaxy S25? There could be something in the pipeline. We'll see. Again, with Apple, any rumor flies, and who knows how credible some of these are, but there's some rumbling around some of that. So that's what I would say in the short term. Medium to longer term, I think the question, of course, and this is probably what Apple shareholders have been most concerned about, after the smartphone era, what product does everybody use? What product supersedes the smartphone? And if you look at what Zuckerberg's trying to do with glasses, I think everybody's trying to aim in that kind of direction. We can go hands-free and be Tony Stark in the Avengers, Iron Man, right? Basically, this idea of moving towards things like glasses, and that's what Apple recently, by the way, has been rumored to be working on, is a set of glasses. We've already seen Meta doing quite well with their Ray-Ban Metas. These are just normal sunglasses but with a camera and some speakers. There's no screen yet. But eventually that's the direction that Zuckerberg's been moving towards. And he's already been showing some of the prototypes that they've been working on that do have a screen. So that's the direction that we're moving in the longer term. But I still think we're very, very far away from that. Many years, at least 5 years, if not longer. Because if you think about it, things like battery are a huge thing. Things like brightness, if we really are having a screen, brightness when you're in broad daylight. And what kind of resolution are you getting on these things? It's not going to be like you're watching a 4K Netflix video on one of these little screens. It's probably going to be more simplistic. So I don't think we're there yet. And I think it's still quite a bit further away. And so in that sense, the smartphone's still going to be here. But maybe to tie this to the earlier discussion we just had about OpenAI and Johnny Ive, well, what is that new product they're working on? Is it some kind of a puck? Whatever kind of product it's going to be. That's going to be some interesting stuff that happens in the longer term. Short term, yeah, let's see if it's a trifold foldable or even a bifold phone from Apple.
I do have questions. I mean, you're talking about it from the technical feasibility, but I'm looking at it from us as consumers. Are we ready for this? Remember with Google Glass? Google Glass was an amazing piece of kit, and that's 10, 12 years ago. But we weren't ready for it socially because we think it's creepy that someone's walking around filming music. But the other thing, more importantly, that I want to come back to is twice you've mentioned Johnny Ive with the fuck. Now, what if they actually did it as two pucks and we could basically be like Princess Leia? So maybe that becomes a whole new design thing we're going around there with two pucks on her head and then some funky glasses and just looking like complete and utter idiots. This could be our future.
And you know what? You're touching on a very good point, which is the problem that the wearables industry has had for some time is tech and fashion don't always mix very well. Right? And glasses, fortunately, Facebook kind of did it right by partnering with Ray-Ban. That actually did work out. But in a lot of these cases, is society even ready for that? Yeah. For, like you said, having things like cameras everywhere. That'll take some time. It took a while even you remember when Bluetooth headsets first came out, right? It's kind of like, why is that dude talking to nobody over there? And it took a while for society to accept that, oh, he's talking on the phone now. We all know now that they're talking on the phone. But it was weird back then when you first saw somebody with that first Bluetooth headset. It's like, that dude talking to nobody.
All right, so let's look at some future trends here. And I'm going to look at it from the negative side. And if you go back through the smartphone industry over time, so I'm old enough to have had the Palm Pilot, which went away. Then there was the handspring trios, those went away. Then you had your Nokia devices, Sony Ericsson, BlackBerry, which we both worked on together when we were at IDC, all went away. What do you think is going to happen? Are you going to see that Apple and Samsung can maintain their lead in the Western world, and then China's just going to be able to continue, like a lot of these vendors like Xiaomi and Huawei still do well in the rest of the world? Or do you think some of these might be set to rise up or fall away?
Yeah, that's always the tricky part, right? And that's, again, probably where Apple shareholders have been a bit concerned about whether Apple, especially if they're behind in Siri, right? Whether they can maintain that lead, especially as AI gets more integrated into these devices. So obviously can go a number of different ways. I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I think the concern, of course, is it's back to that earlier point. What is the thing that, as we move past the smartphone era, what does that technology look like? And maybe to your point, who is the supplier of that in the process? Who is the primary player? Is it OpenAI and this hardware startup that they acquired? Is it a Chinese vendor, like you pointed out? I think that's basically where a lot of the big question marks lie. I would think that you'd still have, with the existing incumbents today and the R&D that they have, there's still going to be a lot that will put them in a good position. But yes, incumbents inherently get disrupted. They got to be on their toes as well, too, because whether that small startup that comes along and just pulls the rug out from under them, that's, of course, the concern.
Now, also, let's take one last look back at Computex. So you mentioned it was a little bit more low-key this year than it has been in previous years. I hardly saw anything. So what I'm wondering is there anything else that I missed that I should be aware of from Computex this year?
Computex, like I said, is primarily, or at least it's been known as a PC show, but a lot of the talk was about data centers, which I don't cover, but that's what Jensen Huang was talking about with NVLink and doing this connective tissue behind all the suppliers around these accelerators that can be built in a data center in these gigantic racks. Foxconn was talking about things like smart factories and so forth. So there's a lot of an industrial slant there, which admittedly I'm not very well versed on to be able to talk about. But I think the other thing I would point out is, even though I said it was low key, I would say that was low key from a PC perspective. And to be fair to the organizers of Computex, this past week coincided with so many other industry events, right? There was Microsoft Build, there was Google I/O, there was Dell Tech World. There were so many events all concurring at the same time. There were some announcements at some of these other shows too. At Microsoft Build, they were talking about Windows and Windows ML, and Windows embracing Anthropic's MCP, which is a protocol that lets AI models talk to each other. Google I/O, they talked about how Gemini is being integrated into more and more layers of the stack. So there's a lot of additional stuff that was also happening over the past week. And Dell, by the way, Dell Tech World, here's an interesting one. At Dell Tech World, they unveiled a workstation. It was a mobile workstation, so it looks like a laptop, but it's got a couple of Qualcomm data center AI chips in the device, basically for AI researchers to run their AI models without having to use a data center, which was quite interesting. And Qualcomm didn't talk about this at Computex because they were waiting for it to be announced at Dell Tech World in the US. And then the next day in Taiwan, oh yeah, I saw the product, but they had it on display after it was finally unveiled. So anyway, my point is, it's not just about PCs, of course. And in fact, to my earlier point on NVIDIA, yes, they were also talking about DGX Spark, which is it looks like a PC. It's like a server that's been compacted down into the size of a PC. Sits on the desktop for an AI researcher to run Linux on and train and I think run inference on these on this box, DGX Spark, $3,000 box. So anyway, it looks like a little Mac Mini kind of little square form.
It's amazing where innovation is going to come from. We're just talking about the fanciest devices and how many megapixels. Now anything's AI related. Now you can get a data center chip inside of a little box. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us again on the podcast and sharing us your latest thoughts. I hope to have you back on again, and I hope to see you for more meals. Take care.
Yeah, thanks.